A poor girl helps an elderly woman who fell on the street. Days later, she's called to a millionaire's mansion and discovers a secret that changes her life. Isabella untied the strings of her apron, sighing quietly as she folded it neatly. Her hands ached from hours of working behind the counter at the bakery, selling bread and pastries to neighbors who barely knew her name. It was exhausting work, but necessary. Every dollar mattered to keep things afloat at home. Her mother, Rose, had taken on all the burdens of life, and Isabella refused to let her carry them alone. She dreamed of better days, but until then, she did what needed to be done. She waved goodbye to her coworker and stepped outside, tightening the strap of her backpack over her shoulder. The route home was familiar. Streets she had walked 1,000 times, always with the same determination in her steps. But today, something broke the rhythm of her routine. Up ahead, she noticed a figure, an elderly woman, moving carefully along the uneven sidewalk. Isabella saw it happen in an instant. The old woman's shoe caught on a crack, and with a sharp gasp, she lost her balance. She hit the ground hard, her body crumpling awkwardly. Isabella's heart jumped. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the woman. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Isabella's voice carried urgency as she knelt beside her, her hands hovering, unsure where to touch without causing more pain. The elderly woman grimaced, her face contorting in discomfort. "I think I twisted my ankle, dear. I can't seem to put any weight on it." Isabella quickly scanned the woman's fragile frame. There were no visible wounds, but the way she held her ankle suggested it was serious enough to make walking impossible. "Let me help you. Can you stand if I hold you?" The woman gave a small nod, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "I'll try, but I'm not sure how far I can go." Isabella carefully slid an arm around the woman's back, lifting her with surprising strength. The old woman winced but managed to stay upright, leaning heavily on the younger girl's shoulder. "Where do you live? Is it far?" "Just a few blocks from here, thank God. I'm afraid I won't get there on my own, though." Isabella smiled gently. "Don't worry, I've got you. Let's take it slow." They began moving step by step, the woman leaning heavily against Isabella. The walk was awkward and slow, but Isabella kept her steady, adjusting her steps with every slight stumble the woman made. As they walked, Isabella couldn't help but notice small details about her. The neatly pressed coat, the pearl earrings, and the old but elegant brooch pinned to her scarf. There was a dignity about the woman, even in her vulnerability. "I'm sorry to be such a bother, dear," the woman said, her voice soft with embarrassment. "You're no bother at all," Isabella replied, glancing sideways at her with a reassuring smile. "I'm just glad I was nearby when it happened." The woman gave a tired chuckle, the corners of her lips curling into a faint smile. Not many people would stop to help a stranger these days. "You must be a rare one." Isabella shrugged lightly. It just seemed like the right thing to do, after what felt like an eternity. They reached a small house nestled between larger buildings. It was old but well kept, with ivy creeping up the brick walls and a wooden porch that looked like it had been freshly painted. "Here we are," the woman sighed with relief. "Home at last." Isabella helped her up the porch steps, making sure she didn't stumble again. "Thank you, my dear. I don't know what I would have done without you. I'm just glad you're safe." The woman turned to her, eyes warm with gratitude. "I'm Margaret Davis," she said, offering a hand with a grace that hadn't left her, despite the pain. "And you, my dear?" "Isabella," the girl answered with a small, polite smile, shaking Margaret's hand. Margaret's expression softened even further, as though the name stirred something within her, though she didn't say what. "Isabella," she repeated slowly, almost savoring the name. "A beautiful name for a beautiful soul." The older woman's words carried an unexpected weight, but Isabella brushed it off, assuming it was just kindness. "Would you like to come inside? I could make you some tea to say thank you properly." Isabella hesitated, glancing at the time on her phone. "That's really sweet of you, Mrs. Davis, but I should get home. My mom's waiting for me." Margaret gave a small nod, though her disappointment was hard to miss. "I understand, but please take this." From the pocket of her coat, Margaret pulled out a small, cream-colored card. There was nothing on it but a handwritten phone number. "If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to call." Isabella accepted the card, slipping it into the back pocket of her jeans. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. I'll keep that in mind." Margaret's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if she wanted to say more but couldn't find the right words. Finally, she gave Isabella a warm smile, though there was something almost wistful behind it. "You take care now, dear." "You too. I hope your ankle feels better soon." With a final wave, Isabella turned and started down the porch steps. She didn't look back, unaware of the way Margaret stood watching her until she disappeared from sight. There was a strange feeling in the pit of Isabella's stomach as she walked away, something she couldn't quite put into words. The encounter had felt ordinary and extraordinary all at once. But Isabella, practical as ever, shook the feeling off. It was just a small, kind moment with a stranger, she told herself. Nothing more. She had no idea how wrong she was. That meeting was only the beginning. It would soon unravel everything she thought she knew about herself and change her life forever. And with that final thought, Isabella tucked the card deeper into her pocket and quickened her pace. Rose would be waiting. There was always something to do, always something to take care of. As far as Isabella was concerned, today was just another day. But soon, the ordinary days would vanish. When Isabella opened the door to their small apartment, she was immediately greeted by a heavy silence. It was the kind of quiet that clung to the air, unsettling in its stillness. Something felt off. As she slipped off her shoes and walked into the living room, she saw her mother, Rose, sitting on the couch, her shoulders hunched. Rose's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze distant, as if she were somewhere far away. "Mom," Isabella called softly, stepping closer. "What happened?" Rose looked up slowly, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. She tried to force a smile, but it crumbled before it could take shape. "I lost my job today, ISA," Rose said, her voice thin and broken. "They said they had to cut costs. I was one of the first to go." The words hit Isabella like a blow to the chest. She knew how hard her mother worked, how tirelessly she pushed through exhaustion to make sure the bills were paid, to put food on their table, and to give Isabella every opportunity she could. And now, that fragile stability, their tightrope balance, had been shattered. Isabella dropped her backpack on the floor and sat down next to her mother. "It's going to be okay, Mom," she whispered, though the knot forming in her throat betrayed her calm exterior. "We'll figure something out. I'll get another job if I need to." Rose shook her head, her expression clouded with worry. "I don't want you sacrificing your studies, ISA. You've worked too hard. You have dreams, real dreams. I can't let you throw them away just to make ends meet." Isabella took her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll make it work. I'll take on more hours at the bakery or find something else. We've been through worse. We've got each other, and that's all we need." Rose looked at her daughter, her heart torn between pride and guilt. Pride, because Isabella was strong beyond her years, stronger than any 17-year-old should have to be. And guilt, because she knew deep down that her daughter shouldn't have to carry the weight of their world on her shoulders. "I'll start looking for something first thing tomorrow," Rose murmured, though the defeat in her voice was hard to miss. "Maybe there's a cleaning job somewhere else." Isabella shook her head firmly. "No, you've been breaking your back for years, Mom. It's time we both stop pretending you have to do everything alone." Rose tried to argue, but the words died on her lips. She knew Isabella meant every word, and she hated how much they relied on each other. It felt unfair. Isabella was still so young. She should be focused on her studies, not worrying about rent or groceries. But life had never given them the luxury of fairness. For a few moments, they sat together in silence. Isabella stared down at the scuffed coffee table, her mind racing. There had to be a way to get through this. They just needed a little bit of luck, a small break. Anything to keep them from sinking deeper. Then, like a spark lighting in the back of her mind, Isabella remembered the card. Margaret Davis. The old woman from the other day had insisted on giving her that card, saying she'd be happy to help if Isabella ever needed anything. Isabella had tucked it away without much thought at the time, but now, it felt like a lifeline. She reached into the back pocket of her jeans, pulling out the cream-colored card with Margaret's phone number scrawled neatly across it. "Mom, I think I know someone who might be able to help." Rose glanced at the card in her daughter's hand, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Who's that?" "Margaret Davis. She's this woman I helped the other day, an older lady. She fell, and I helped her get home. She was really kind, and she gave me this. Said I could call if I ever needed anything." Rose stared at the card for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't the kind of person to rely on the kindness of strangers, much less ask for help. But she also knew they didn't have many options right now. "Do you really think she'll help us?" Rose asked cautiously. Isabella hesitated. She wasn't sure what Margaret could offer, maybe nothing at all. But there had been something genuine about the woman, something that made Isabella believe her words weren't empty. "I think it's worth a try," Isabella said quietly. Rose nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "All right, let's call her tomorrow. No harm in asking." Isabella gave her mother a small, reassuring smile, though anxiety churned in her stomach. What if this woman couldn't help them? What if the call led to nothing but polite regret? But even with those doubts creeping in, she knew she had to try. "We'll figure this out, Mom. I promise." Rose reached up, brushing a hand gently through Isabella's dark hair. "You've always been my brave girl," Rose whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Isabella leaned into the touch, feeling the warmth of her mother's hand. "And you'll never have to find out," she replied softly. They sat there, holding on to each other, as if by staying close they could keep the world from falling apart. For tonight, that would have to be enough. The next morning, Isabella woke up earlier than usual, determined to make the call before nerves got the better of her. She sat on the edge of her bed, the phone heavy in her hand as she stared at the card one more time. The number was simple, just a string of digits, but dialing it felt like crossing an invisible line. Taking a deep breath, she punched the numbers into her phone and pressed the call button. The ringing seemed to go on forever, each second stretching painfully long, until finally, a man's voice answered on the other end. "Hello." Isabella sat up straighter. "Hi. I'm looking for Mrs. Margaret Davis. Is she there?" "Yes, just a moment. Who may I say is calling?" "It's Isabella." There was a brief pause, followed by muffled sounds in the background. Then, a familiar voice came through the line, warm and welcoming. "Isabella, how wonderful to hear from you. Is everything all right?" Isabella swallowed hard, suddenly unsure how to begin. "Hi, Mrs. Davis. I wanted to check on you, see how you were doing." Margaret chuckled lightly on the other end of the line. "Oh, I'm doing much better, thanks to you, dear. But something tells me you didn't call just to chat." Isabella bit her lip. Margaret's kindness was disarming, making it harder to admit why she'd really called. "Actually, there's something I was hoping to ask you," Isabella said cautiously. "It's kind of a big favor." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you need, sweetheart." Isabella glanced toward the kitchen, where Rose was quietly brewing coffee, pretending not to listen but clearly hanging on every word. "My mom, she lost her job yesterday, and we're trying to figure things out, but it's been hard. I don't know if you can help, but I thought maybe you might know someone." There was a brief silence on the line, but when Margaret spoke again, her voice was steady and filled with empathy. "Isabella, why don't you and your mother come over for lunch this weekend? We can talk more then. I'd love to help, however I can." Isabella exhaled, the tension in her chest easing just a little. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. That means a lot." "It's nothing, dear." I'm looking forward to seeing you again." As Isabella ended the call, she met her mother's questioning gaze from across the room. "She invited us for lunch this weekend," Isabella said, her voice light with cautious hope. Rose raised an eyebrow. "Lunch, huh? Let's see where this goes." And just like that, a small glimmer of hope flickered between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When Isabella and Rose arrived at Margaret Davis's house, they were greeted with warmth that felt both unexpected and oddly familiar. Margaret opened the door with a wide smile, her eyes lighting up as if she were welcoming old friends rather than recent acquaintances. "I'm so glad you both could come. Please come in," Margaret said, stepping aside to usher them into her home. The interior was understated but elegant, refined without feeling overdone. There were old photographs framed along the walls and antique furniture that gave the house a sense of history. Yet it wasn't the wealth and the decor that stood out. It was the atmosphere. There was a calmness about the place, an invitation to relax, to feel at home. "Make yourselves comfortable. I prepared something simple, but I hope you'll like it," Margaret said as she led them to the dining room. Isabella exchanged a brief glance with her mother. Despite their initial nerves, it was hard to feel out of place here. Margaret's kindness had a way of dissolving the awkwardness that might have otherwise lingered. They sat down at a beautifully set table, the silverware glinting in the soft light. Margaret served them herself, despite their polite protests. "You've done enough for us already," Rose said, smiling. "Nonsense," Margaret replied. "It's not every day I get to host such wonderful company." The conversation flowed easily as they began to eat. Margaret's curiosity about their lives was genuine, her questions gentle but thoughtful. Isabella mentioned that she dreams of becoming a doctor, Margaret said, turning her warm gaze toward Rose. "That's quite remarkable." Rose smiled softly, pride evident in her expression. "She's always been that way, focused, determined." "It's because of you, Mom," Isabella said, nudging Rose playfully. "You made sure I stayed on track." Margaret's eyes softened as she listened to them. There was admiration in her expression, but there was something else too, something deeper, as if she were seeing pieces of a puzzle finally come together. "Your mother must be very proud of you," Margaret said with a quiet intensity that made Isabella pause. For a brief moment, the table fell silent, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. But Margaret quickly shifted the tone, guiding the conversation back to lighter topics. They shared stories, laughed about small mishaps, and let the hours pass as if they had known each other for years. After the meal, Margaret excused herself briefly. When she returned, she was accompanied by a tall, well-dressed man with an easy, confident smile. "This is my son, Richard," Margaret said warmly. "Richard, these are the wonderful women I've been telling you about, Isabella and Rose." Richard extended his hand first to Rose, then to Isabella. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," he said, his voice smooth and friendly. "My mother hasn't stopped talking about you, Isabella." Isabella felt her cheeks flush slightly but managed a polite smile. "All good things, I hope. Only the best," Richard replied with a grin. "She told me how you helped her when she needed it most." "It was nothing, really," Isabella said, brushing it off. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone," Margaret interjected quietly, "and certainly not with such kindness." The room fell into a comfortable rhythm again, Richard joining their conversation with ease. But after a while, Margaret's demeanor shifted ever so slightly. The playful glimmer in her eye dimmed, and her hands folded neatly in her lap. She seemed to brace herself, as if gathering the strength to say something important. "There's something I need to tell you both," Margaret began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. Isabella and Rose exchanged wary glances. "Ever since the day you helped me, Isabella," Margaret continued, "I've felt a connection. Something I couldn't quite explain at first, but it made me want to know more about you." Isabella leaned forward slightly, her heart thudding in her chest. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with emotions too complex to name. Then she took a deep breath and pressed on. Many years ago, I had a daughter. She was taken from me under very difficult circumstances. I spent years trying to find her, but recently, I learned that she passed away. Rose's breath hitched beside Isabella, and the younger girl felt her stomach twist painfully. I also found out, Margaret continued, her voice trembling slightly, that my daughter had a child, a little girl. Margaret's gaze locked onto Isabella's, and the weight of her words settled over the room like a tidal wave. Isabella, I believe that little girl is you. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Isabella stared at Margaret, her mind reeling, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. What? Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. Rose shifted uneasily beside her, guilt etched into every line of her face. Isabella, I need to tell you something, Rose said, her voice cracking under the strain. There's something I never told you. Isabella turned to her mother, confusion and fear swirling in her chest. What do you mean? Rose lowered her gaze, unable to meet Isabella's eyes. You were adopted, Rose whispered. I found you when you were just a baby, left at the door of a church. I've raised you as my own ever since. Isabella felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. Why? Isabella's voice cracked as she fought to hold back tears. Why didn't you ever tell me? Rose reached out, desperate to offer comfort, but Isabella pulled away slightly, the shock too raw. I was afraid, Rose admitted, her voice heavy with emotion. Afraid you'd feel different, that you wouldn't think of me as your mother anymore. I never wanted you to doubt how much I love you. Tears blurred Isabella's vision. The betrayal stung, but beneath it, she saw the fear and love in her mother's eyes. The fear of losing the one thing she held dearest in the world. Before Isabella could say anything, Margaret gently placed her hand over Isabella's. I'm not here to take your mother's place, Margaret said softly. Rose is your mother in every way that matters. But I would love the chance to be a part of your life. If you'll let me. Isabella sat frozen, emotions warring within her. Anger, confusion, sadness, and something else. A strange sense of belonging, as if the pieces of a long-lost puzzle were finally falling into place. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Isabella exhaled, feeling the weight of everything settle around her. I just need some time to think, Isabella whispered, wiping her tears. Margaret gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. Rose looked at Isabella with a mixture of guilt and hope, as if silently begging for forgiveness. We'll get through this, Rose said softly. Together, Isabella nodded, though her mind was still spinning. I just need to understand all of it. Margaret smiled warmly, though tears glistened in her eyes. And I'll be here, Isabella, whenever you're ready. As Isabella looked between Rose and Margaret, she felt something unfamiliar. A strange but undeniable sense of possibility. Perhaps for the first time, she was beginning to understand that family could be more complicated and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. And with that, they left the conversation unfinished, knowing that the real journey was only just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Isabella, processing Margaret's revelation, discovering she had a family she never knew, was overwhelming. She needed time to think, to reflect on what it meant to have this new connection without losing the bond she had with Rose, the woman who had been her mother in every way that mattered. For the first few days, Isabella kept her distance. She didn't call Margaret or Richard right away. She wasn't angry, exactly, but she needed space. How could she fit Margaret and Richard into her life without making Rose feel replaced? The thought weighed on her, filling her mind with unanswered questions. But slowly, little by little, the walls she had built around herself began to crack. Margaret didn't push, but she reached out, short, gentle messages, always ending with, *, whenever you're ready, dear. *, Rose, for her part, encouraged Isabella to take the chance. "It's okay to let them in," Rose said one night as they sat at the kitchen table. "They're not taking you from me. They just want to know you." After days of wrestling with her thoughts, Isabella finally made her decision. She would open the door to Margaret and Richard, but on her terms. If they wanted to be in her life, they'd have to understand that Rose would always be her mother. She wasn't looking to replace anything, just to add something new. When Isabella shared her decision with Margaret, the older woman's joy was quiet but genuine. "Thank you, Isabella. That's all I ever wanted," Margaret said softly, her eyes glistening. Richard echoed her sentiment with an easy smile. "We're really happy to have you in our lives, Isabella, and we want to support you however we can." Margaret's idea of support was more than Isabella had expected. A few days later, Margaret invited Isabella and Rose back to her house for tea. She wasted no time in explaining her offer. "I'd like to help you with your education, Isabella. There's a wonderful private school nearby that I believe could challenge you academically. I've already spoken to the administrators. If you're willing, they're ready to offer you a spot." Isabella blinked, stunned. "A private school? That sounds amazing, but..." Margaret held up a hand, silencing Isabella's protest. "It's a full scholarship, dear. You wouldn't have to pay a thing. I've taken care of everything." Isabella turned to Rose, unsure how to respond. A private education sounded incredible, like an impossible dream, but she felt uneasy accepting so much. "I don't know, Mom," Isabella murmured. "It's a lot." Rose gave her an encouraging smile. "You deserve this, Isa. You've worked so hard. Maybe it's time to let someone help us for a change." Though hesitant, Isabella agreed. As long as she could remain grounded and stay close to Rose, she was willing to try. Meanwhile, Richard's support came in a different form. One afternoon, while Isabella and Rose were visiting Margaret again, Richard pulled Rose aside for a conversation. "Mrs. Smith, I'd like to offer you a position at my company," Richard said with a friendly but professional tone. Rose's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want any special treatment just because of Isabella." Richard smiled. "It's not special treatment. I've seen the way you've handled things, your dedication, your hard work. We could use someone like you. And honestly, you'd be doing me a favor by taking the job." Despite her initial reluctance, Rose accepted the position on one condition. "I need to earn my place. No handouts." Richard respected that. He admired Rose's integrity, and from the start, she proved to be an asset to the company. At first, life felt lighter, with Isabella starting at the new school and Rose settling into her new job. Things finally seemed to be looking up. The financial pressure eased just enough for them to breathe. Isabella immersed herself in her studies, determined to make the most of her new opportunity. She kept her old friends close, but also began to make new ones, slowly adjusting to the different pace of her new school. But just as things seemed to settle into place, cracks began to appear. At Richard's company, Rose's hard work and professionalism quickly caught the attention of her colleagues, and not all of it was positive. Patricia Miller, a longtime employee with a sharp tongue and a tendency toward office gossip, began to take an interest in Rose's sudden rise through the company ranks. It didn't take long for Patricia's resentment to fester into something malicious. She started whispering behind Rose's back, sowing doubts and suspicions among the other employees. "You know why she got that job, right?" Patricia said one afternoon in the break room, her voice dripping with insinuation. The small group of employees around her exchanged knowing glances. "I heard she's close to Richard Davis. Real close, if you know what I mean." The gossip spread like wildfire. Within days, the whispers had turned into full-blown rumors. Employees began to speculate that Rose's position wasn't earned, but given as a favor for reasons that had little to do with merit. The rumors eventually reached Isabella. She overheard two girls in the hallway of her new school giggling about it. Apparently, her mom's having an affair with the boss, one of them whispered, not realizing Isabella was within earshot. Isabella's blood ran cold. The humiliation was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by a burning anger. She didn't care about the petty gossip. What she cared about was how it might affect her mother. Rose had worked too hard for too long to have her reputation tarnished by a jealous coworker. When Isabella confronted Rose about the rumors that evening, her mother gave her a tired but determined smile. "I've dealt with worse." "ISA," Rose said, brushing it off. "It's just noise. Let them talk." "It's not just noise, Mom," Isabella replied, her jaw tight. "They're trying to tear you down." Rose reached across the table and placed her hand over Isabella's. "I'm not going to let some gossip take me down, honey. I faced tougher battles than this." Isabella nodded, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't fair. After everything Rose had been through, she didn't deserve this. Isabella knew her mother was strong, but that didn't mean she had to fight alone. Richard wasn't oblivious to the situation, either. He knew exactly where the rumors were coming from, and he wasn't about to let it slide. One afternoon, he called Patricia Miller into his office. "Patricia, close the door," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. Patricia entered with a smug expression, as if she believed she had nothing to worry about. "Is there a problem, Mr. Davis?" she asked, feigning innocence. Richard leaned forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I know what you've been saying about Rose Smith." Patricia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, it's just office talk. You know how people are." Richard's expression hardened. "No, Patricia. What you've been spreading is slander, and it ends now." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't mean any harm. You meant exactly what you said," Richard interrupted coldly, "and I won't tolerate it. Consider this your warning. If I hear one more word about Rose, you're out." Patricia's face flushed with anger, but she bit her tongue. "Understood," she muttered through clenched teeth. Richard gave a curt nod. "Good. Now get back to work." As Patricia stormed out of his office, her mind churned with thoughts of revenge. She wasn't finished, far from it, and as she walked away, a dangerous idea began to form in the back of her mind. For now, things seemed to settle, but Richard knew better than to believe the problem was entirely resolved. Isabella sensed it too, the calm before the storm. Something told her that Patricia wasn't the type to let things go quietly, and soon her instincts would prove right. The rumors gnawed at Isabella for days. No matter how hard she tried to push the gossip out of her mind, it festered like an open wound. Every whisper she overheard in the hallways at school, asterisk, her mom's only there because of the boss, asterisk, made her blood boil. Rose had earned her place with grit and hard work, and yet people were eager to tear her down just to satisfy their pettiness. Isabella had heard enough. She knew who was responsible for starting the rumors. Patricia Miller. The smug tone, the bitterness. Richard had mentioned Patricia's dissatisfaction after he warned her, but clearly the warning hadn't been enough. Now, it was personal. Isabella decided that if Patricia wanted to play dirty, then she'd meet her face to face. The next afternoon, Isabella left school early and made her way to Richard's company, slipping unnoticed into the building. Her mother didn't know she was coming, and she wasn't planning on waiting for anyone's permission. Isabella walked through the hallways, her heart pounding, her anger simmering just below the surface. When she spotted Patricia near the break room, chatting with a co-worker, Isabella didn't hesitate. She marched straight toward her, cutting through the small crowd of employees, her jaw tight with determination. "You and I need to talk," Isabella said, her voice sharp. Patricia turned, her lips curling into a smug smile the moment she recognized her. "Oh, look who it is. The princess herself." The condescension in Patricia's voice only fueled Isabella's fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Isabella demanded, stepping closer. "What do you get out of spreading lies about my mom?" Patricia crossed her arms, her expression cool and amused. "Lies? I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." "No one else is thinking that," Isabella shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "You're just bitter and bored." My mom worked her ass off to get here. You have no right. Please, Patricia interrupted with a scoff. Your mom didn't work her way up. She got a shortcut thanks to your rich uncle. Isabella's fist clenched at her sides. You don't know anything about my mom, she hissed. She's done more honest work in a week than you have in your entire career. Patricia tilted her head, her smile widening with malicious glee. Are we getting a little defensive now? I hit a nerve, didn't I? Isabella took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The hallway had gone quiet. A small group of employees watched from a distance, their curiosity piqued. You can insult me all you want, Isabella said through gritted teeth, but you don't get to drag my mom down just because you hate your life. Patricia's smile faltered for a second, but her arrogance quickly returned. You're just a kid, she sneered. You don't understand how the world works. People like your mom, they don't get jobs like this unless they know someone. And everyone here knows it. Isabella felt a sharp sting in her chest, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she narrowed her eyes. You're pathetic. Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a voice cut through the tension. What the hell is going on here? Everyone turned. Richard stood at the end of the hallway, his expression dark and unreadable. The employees scattered, sensing that the confrontation had reached its breaking point. Richard, Patricia began, her tone shifting to fake innocence. I was just... Save it, Richard snapped, striding toward them. He stopped just inches from Patricia, towering over her with an air of authority that demanded respect. I warned you once, and you clearly didn't listen. Patricia's face flushed, her composure faltering for the first time. It's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, Richard interrupted coldly. And I'm done giving you chances. He turned to Isabella, his expression softening for a brief moment. Are you okay? Isabella gave a small nod, though her hands were still trembling with adrenaline. I'm fine, she whispered, but this needs to stop. Richard nodded grimly, then turned his attention back to Patricia. You're done here, he said, his voice low but firm. Pack your things and leave. You're fired. Patricia's eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious, Richard said flatly. And if I hear one more word about Rose or Isabella, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. Patricia's face twisted with rage, but she knew there was nothing more she could say. With a furious huff, she turned on her heel and stormed toward her desk, muttering curses under her breath. As she walked away, Isabella exhaled slowly, the tension draining from her body. But even as Patricia disappeared from view, a nagging feeling remained in the back of her mind. Do you think she's really gone? Isabella asked quietly. Richard glanced down the hallway, his jaw tight. She'll leave the building, but people like her don't just go away quietly. Later that evening, Isabella sat on the couch with Rose, recounting the events of the day. Her mother listened silently, her expression unreadable. But Isabella knew her well enough to see the worry flickering beneath the surface. I didn't want you to get involved, Isa, Rose said softly when Isabella finished. I couldn't just stand by, Mom, Isabella replied, her voice firm. I had to say something. Rose sighed, brushing a hand through her hair. You didn't have to, but thank you, she whispered. Isabella gave her mother a small, reassuring smile. We're in this together, right? Rose pulled Isabella into a tight embrace. Always. The next morning, Richard gathered his employees for a brief meeting, making it clear that the rumors about Rose were to stop immediately. The message was received loud and clear. No one wanted to risk following in Patricia's footsteps. For a moment, it seemed like the storm had passed. Rose focused on her work, determined to prove she belonged. Isabella returned to school, throwing herself into her studies. Richard kept a close eye on the company, making sure no more fires ignited under his watch. But just when they thought the worst was behind them, trouble resurfaced, this time in a far more dangerous way. It started with a phone call. Isabella was walking home from school when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, frowning when she saw the unfamiliar number. "Hello," she answered cautiously. There was a brief pause, followed by the click of someone hanging up. Isabella stared at the screen, unease settling in her chest. She tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. The strange call was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Isabella began noticing things. Cars parked too long near their building, shadows moving where they shouldn't be. And then one evening, as she walked home from school, everything came crashing down. A black car pulled up beside her, and before she could react, two men jumped out. "Get in the car," one of them barked, grabbing her arm. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled against them, panic clawing at her throat. "Let go of me," she screamed, kicking and thrashing. But the men were strong, and within moments, they dragged her into the car and slammed the door shut. "You're going to be a message," one of the men muttered as the car sped away. "Your uncle will understand soon enough." Terror gripped Isabella as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just about Patricia's jealousy. This was something much worse. With shaking hands, Isabella reached into her pocket and, without drawing attention to herself, sent a single message. "Help. I'm in trouble, *." She hit send, praying Richard would see it in time. It had been a few quiet days since Patricia's dismissal, but Isabella couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. Every time she walked home from school, she felt eyes on her. Cars lingered too long at corners. Shadows seemed to shift where they shouldn't. At first, she thought it was just paranoia, a side effect of the tension after the confrontation with Patricia. But today was different. Today, the feeling was sharper. Her heart began to race as she walked down the familiar streets toward home. She kept glancing over her shoulder, certain that someone was following her. But every time she looked back, there was no one there. The streets felt too empty, too silent. She gripped her phone tightly in her hand, her thumb hovering over the screen. And then, out of nowhere, a black car rolled up beside her, matching her pace. The windows were tinted too dark to see who was inside, but Isabella's instinct screamed at her to run. She spun on her heel, ready to bolt. But the door to the car flew open, and two men jumped out. "Hey, what?" Isabella barely had time to scream before one of the men grabbed her arm. "Get off me!" she shrieked, kicking wildly. But they were too strong. Her backpack slipped from her shoulder and hit the ground as one man locked his arms around her waist, lifting her off the sidewalk. "Stop fighting, kid," one of them hissed through gritted teeth. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Isabella's heart pounded wildly in her chest. Every instinct told her to fight. But the second man yanked open the back door of the car, and they shoved her inside. The door slammed shut with a chilling finality. "What do you want from me?" she cried, struggling against the seatbelt they forced over her. One of the men, sitting beside her now, gave a cruel grin. "You're going to send a message," he said, his voice low and sinister. "To your dear uncle and grandma." Terror gripped her as the car sped off. She tried to focus, to steady her breathing despite the panic clawing at her throat. The world outside the window blurred as they drove, and she knew they weren't heading anywhere familiar. "I need to stay calm. I can't lose it now, *." Isabella's heart pounded as she thought of Richard, of Margaret, her family. And then it hit her. She still had her phone. They hadn't checked her pockets. She slipped her hand carefully into her hoodie pocket, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of her phone. The men were distracted, arguing about directions, laughing like they were enjoying the whole thing. Now was her chance. With shaking hands, Isabella unlocked her phone, keeping it low and out of sight. She opened her messages and tapped on Richard's contact. The car hit a bump, making her drop the phone for a second, but she caught it before it slid away. Focus, Isabella. Just focus, *. She typed quickly. Help. Black car. Taken. Sending location, *. Before the men noticed, she hit send and enabled location sharing. A small sent confirmation appeared on the screen, and relief washed over her for a brief second, just enough to stop her hands from trembling. "Hey, what are you doing?" One of the men snapped, noticing the movement out of the corner of his eye. Isabella shoved the phone back into her pocket, glaring at him with as much defiance as she could muster. "Nothing. What do you care?" she spat, her voice steady despite the fear roiling in her gut. The man leaned in close, his breath hot and sour against her face. "You've got some guts, kid," he muttered darkly. "Let's see how long that lasts." The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, smirking. "She's tougher than she looks," he said with a laugh. Isabella clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, forcing herself to stay calm. The car sped through unfamiliar streets, and every second that passed felt like an eternity. She could only hope that Richard saw her message in time. Miles away, Richard's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced down, expecting it to be a routine message, but the moment he saw Isabella's name, his blood ran cold. The message was brief but chilling. Asterisk help. Black car. Taken. Sending location asterisk. His heart pounded as he opened the live location link, seeing a small, moving rapidly across the city. He didn't waste a second. Grabbing his phone, he called the police and relayed the message with a voice that left no room for hesitation. "This is Richard Davis. My niece has been abducted. I've got her live location. Sending it now." He didn't wait for a response. With the phone still in his hand, he bolted out the door and jumped into his car. Asterisk, hang on, Isabella. I'm coming, asterisk. Back in the black car, the tension thickened. The men had stopped laughing and were focused on their destination, muttering between themselves. Isabella knew they were heading somewhere isolated. Time was running out. Her stomach twisted as the car turned down a narrow alley, the tall buildings on either side casting long shadows over the road. She glanced out the window, her breath catching as she realized there was no one around. No witnesses, no one to call for help. And then, just as the hopelessness began to creep in, the sound of sirens erupted in the distance. The men tensed immediately. "Shit," the driver cursed, slamming his hand on the steering wheel. "How the hell did they find us?" The man sitting beside Isabella grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her closer. "What did you do?" he growled, his face inches from hers. Isabella smirked, the first flicker of triumph burning in her chest. "I told you," she whispered. "What do you care?" Before the man could respond, the flashing red and blue lights of police cars lit up the alley, blocking both ends. Officers poured out of their vehicles, guns drawn, shouting commands. "Hands where we can see them. Step out of the car now." The men exchanged frantic looks. "We're screwed," the driver muttered. "Shut up," the other snapped, but his voice cracked under the weight of panic. With no way out, the men reluctantly raised their hands and opened the doors. Isabella pressed herself against the seat, her heart racing as officers surrounded the vehicle. "It's okay, miss. You're safe now," one of the officers said as he opened the door for her. Isabella stumbled out, her legs shaky but still working. The cool night air hit her skin, but she hardly noticed. She was free. A familiar voice called her name, and when she looked up, she saw Richard running toward her, his face a mixture of relief and fury. "Isabella," he shouted, pulling her into a tight embrace. She collapsed against him, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her voice wavered. "I sent a message." Richard cupped her face in his hands, his expression fierce. "You were brilliant, kid. You did everything right." Isabella managed a small, tired smile. "I knew you'd come." The officers moved quickly, cuffing the two kidnappers and shoving them into the back of patrol cars. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Patricia Miller was behind the entire scheme. After her firing, she'd hired the men to kidnap Isabella, hoping to send a message to Richard and Margaret, a twisted act of revenge for being cut out of the company. At the police station, Isabella sat quietly as officers took her statement. Margaret arrived not long after, wrapping Isabella in a tearful embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here," Isabella said softly, leaning into her grandmother's warmth. "I'm not going anywhere." Rose arrived moments later, her face pale with worry. She pulled Isabella close, her hands trembling as she ran them through her daughter's hair. "You're safe," Rose whispered over and over, as if saying it would make it more real. Isabella closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her family surround her. But even as they held her close, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Patricia was in custody, but the damage had been done. They'd escaped with their lives. But the fear still lingered, waiting in the shadows. And they all knew Patricia wasn't finished yet. At the police station, Isabella sat in a cold plastic chair, her body still buzzing from the adrenaline. The officers moved around her, filing reports and speaking in low voices. Every now and then, one would glance her way, offering a small nod of reassurance. But nothing felt real yet. Her hands rested on her lap, still shaking slightly. She stared at the wall, her mind replaying the moment the car doors slammed shut, trapping her inside. A familiar voice pulled her out of her thoughts. "Isabella?" She barely had time to register the sound before Margaret rushed toward her, pulling her into a tight, almost desperate embrace. The warmth of her grandmother's arms melted the tension in Isabella's shoulders, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. "I can't bear the thought of losing you again," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Isabella could feel Margaret's hands trembling as they cradled her head, and the weight of her grandmother's words settled deep in her heart. She hadn't fully understood how much she mattered to Margaret until this moment. "I'm okay, Grandma," Isabella whispered into her shoulder. "I'm here." Margaret pulled back, just enough to look into her granddaughter's eyes, tears shimmering behind her lashes. "I've waited so long to find you, Isabella. I wouldn't survive losing you." Before Isabella could respond, another set of arms wrapped around her from behind. Rose pulled her close, sandwiching her between herself and Margaret. "You're everything to us, Isa," Rose whispered, her voice thick with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed earlier. "I was so scared. I don't know what I would have done if—" She trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Isabella let herself lean into both women, feeling the overwhelming presence of their love and fear. It was strange, being held so tightly by two women who represented different parts of her life. Yet, in this moment, it all made sense. These were her mothers, one by blood and the other by choice. Both of them had fought in their own ways to keep her safe, and both had been terrified of losing her. "I have two incredible moms," Isabella said softly, emotion thick in her voice. Margaret smiled through her tears, brushing a strand of Isabella's hair behind her ear. "We're the lucky ones," she murmured. Rose kissed the top of Isabella's head, holding on as if she might disappear if she let go. "We've got you, sweetheart. We've got you." For a few moments, they stayed like that, three hearts beating in sync, holding each other in the quiet sanctuary of shared relief. After the emotional reunion, Richard arrived at the station, his face a mixture of exhaustion and fury. His jaw clenched tight as he approached them, his eyes scanning Isabella to make sure she was unharmed. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Isabella nodded. "I am now." Richard exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. He crouched down so he was eye level with Isabella, his expression softening. "You were brave today, Isa. Smarter than most adults I know." "I just did what I had to do," she muttered. Richard gave her a small, proud smile. "Well, it was enough to save your life." Margaret squeezed Isabella's hand, still unwilling to let her go entirely. "Thank you, Richard," Margaret whispered. "I don't know how we would have gotten through this without you." Richard gave her a brief nod, then turned back to Isabella. "And don't worry about Patricia. She's not coming near any of you again. The police are charging her with everything they've got. The mention of Patricia sent a shiver through Isabella, but she forced herself to meet Richard's gaze. What if she tries something else? Richard's expression hardened, his protective instincts kicking in. She won't. I'll make sure of it. Rose gently touched Isabella's cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear Isabella hadn't realized was falling. You don't have to think about her anymore, ISA. We're going to keep you safe. Always. The officers soon finished taking Isabella's statement and reassured them that Patricia and the kidnappers would remain in custody. As they walked out of the station together, Isabella in the middle, held close by both Rose and Margaret, the weight of everything began to lift from her shoulders. Outside, the night felt quieter, less threatening. Richard's car was parked at the curb, waiting to take them all home. "Come on," he said, opening the door for them. "Let's get you out of here." They climbed into the car, the tension of the day slowly ebbing away. Isabella leaned her head against the cool window, exhaustion catching up with her. As the car moved through the city streets, Isabella felt the quiet hum of safety settle around her. The fear was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Rose glanced at her from the front seat, her gaze full of unspoken love. "We'll be okay," Rose whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Margaret, seated beside Isabella, rested a hand on her knee. "We're a family now," Margaret said softly. "Nothing will ever take that away from us." Isabella smiled, the warmth of their words sinking deep into her heart. For the first time in a long time, she felt something close to peace. Over the following months, life slowly began to regain its rhythm. The trauma of the kidnapping faded into the background, not forgotten, but no longer a shadow hanging over their every move. Isabella embraced the ordinary moments with a new appreciation, knowing that things could have ended so differently. She refused to let fear define her future. And most importantly, she was determined to pursue the dream she had held onto her entire life: becoming a doctor. Getting into medical school was a monumental victory, one Isabella earned through hard work and resilience. The day her acceptance letter arrived, she ran into the kitchen, waving the envelope with a wide grin. "Mom, Grandma, I got in." Rose dropped the dish she was washing and spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? Let me see." Isabella handed her the letter, and Rose scanned the words quickly, her hands shaking. Tears welled in her eyes as she read the confirmation. Accepted into the pre-med program. "Oh my God, ISA," Rose whispered, pulling her daughter into a fierce hug. "You did it, baby. I'm so proud of you." Margaret entered the room just in time to hear the news, her expression brightening instantly. "I knew you'd make it," Margaret said, joining the embrace. "We always knew you were meant for something great." Isabella laughed, holding them both tight. She could feel their pride and love wrapping around her, and it made every late night of studying, every hurdle along the way, worth it. "This is just the beginning," Isabella said, her voice soft but full of excitement. As the school year began, Isabella threw herself into her studies with the same determination that had carried her through so many challenges before. Medical school was demanding, far more intense than she had expected, but she loved every moment of it. Every lecture, every lab, every late night spent poring over textbooks. Richard remained a steady presence in her life, checking in often to make sure she had everything she needed. He wasn't just an uncle now. He was family in every sense of the word. "How's my favorite med student doing?" Richard asked during one of their regular phone calls. Isabella laughed, her voice tired but happy. "Exhausted, but good. I think I finally understand the cardiovascular system. Mostly." Richard chuckled on the other end of the line. "That's my girl. Just remember, if you ever need a break, I've got your back." "Thanks, Uncle Richard. But you know me, I don't really do breaks." "No kidding," he said with a grin in his voice. "But don't burn yourself out, all right?" Even as he teased, there was pride in his voice, a deep sense of satisfaction in seeing his niece flourish. Meanwhile, The bond between Rose and Margaret grew stronger with each passing day. The two women, so different on the surface, had found common ground in their love for Isabella. They spent afternoons together drinking tea, swapping stories, and planning small ways to surprise Isabella during her long study sessions. "We should bake her cookies," Margaret suggested one day, her eyes sparkling. "She loves those peanut butter ones," Rose agreed, already grabbing ingredients from the pantry. "You really have a way of spoiling her, you know." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "I think I'm just making up for lost time." Rose placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, her expression warm and understanding. "We're all making up for something," she said gently. "But the important thing is that we have each other now." Margaret nodded, grateful beyond words. "Yes, and we always will." Isabella's world expanded, but she never drifted away from the people who mattered most. As busy as she was with school, she always found time to visit Rose, Margaret, and Richard. Their small family gatherings were sacred to her, a way to ground herself amidst the chaos of medical school. At one of these gatherings, they sat around the dinner table, talking and laughing late into the night. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching Isabella animatedly describe a recent class on anatomy. "You've come a long way, kid," he said with a grin. Isabella smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest. "I had a lot of help along the way." Margaret reached across the table, squeezing Isabella's hand. "And we'll always be here to help, no matter what," she promised. Rose smiled softly, the love in her eyes unmistakable. "You'll never have to go through anything alone, Isa. Not ever again." Isabella felt a lump rise in her throat, but this time it was from joy. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And I love you all so much." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who truly understand and care for one another. In the years that followed, Isabella continued to grow, not just as a student, but as a person. She became the kind of doctor she had always dreamed of, compassionate, tireless, and dedicated to making a difference in the lives of others. Her journey wasn't without challenges. There were days when the pressure felt unbearable, when the exhaustion made her question everything. But in those moments, she remembered the hands that had held her when she was scared, the voices that had reassured her when she doubted herself. And that was enough to keep her moving forward. Margaret and Rose attended every milestone, every graduation, every celebration, cheering Isabella on from the front row. They were always there, proud and unwavering. Richard, too, remained her biggest supporter. As she grew into her career, he watched with quiet pride, knowing that she was shaping a future filled with purpose and compassion. Isabella's story wasn't just about finding her path. It was about discovering a family she hadn't known existed. A family built on love, forgiveness, and the unshakable promise that they would always stand by each other. The young girl who once helped an elderly woman on the street had found more than just a connection. She had found a grandmother, an uncle, and a deeper bond with a mother who had raised her with unwavering love. Their story wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and full of unexpected twists. But it was theirs, a story of second chances, of learning to trust, and of choosing love even when it felt difficult. And through it all, Isabella learned one of life's most valuable lessons. Family isn't just about where you come from. It's about the people who show up, stay by your side, and help you become the best version of yourself. And that was a future Isabella knew she could believe in. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.